Get on your knees, Major Ryan Whitmore pressed his hand down hard on Claire Morgan's shoulder in front of 40 soldiers and forced her toward the ground. You want to investigate this unit, then crawl. Show everyone here what you really are. The room stopped breathing. Not one soldier moved. Not one voice spoke. Claire's knees never touched the floor. She straightened, slowly turned her head, and looked at Whitmore with eyes that had seen things that would have broken every man standing in that room. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. I've buried better men than you. Whitmore laughed. He had no idea those words were a warning. Subscribe right now. Drop your city in the comments. Because the moment this man realized his catastrophic mistake will make your jaw drop. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, when the air at Fort Liberty still carried the damp chill of a Carolina autumn that hadn't quite decided whether it wanted to stay or leave. Claire Morgan stepped out of a gray government sedan, carrying one bag, a worn leather briefcase, and the kind of face that told you absolutely nothing about what was happening inside it. She was 38 years old. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall. She wore dark slacks, a navy blue jacket, and flat shoes that made no sound when she walked. There was no unit insignia on her clothing. No medals, no rank, no identifier of any kind, except for a small laminated badge clipped to her lapel that read, Civilian Logistics Consultant Authorized Access Level 3. The sergeant at the gate, a young man named Corporal Davis who had been stationed at Fort Liberty for 8 months and believed that gave him the authority to read people on sight, looked at her badge, looked at her face, looked at her one bag and said, You sure you're in the right place, ma'am? Claire handed him her paperwork without responding to the question. He scanned it, frowned at something, scanned it again, and then waved her through without another word. She walked across the parking area toward the administrative building alone. Nobody came to meet her. Nobody had been assigned to escort her. She had been told that her contact would be waiting at the security office, but when she arrived, the security office was empty, except for a young private who looked up from his phone with the expression of someone who had not expected to see a visitor and was not entirely sure what to do about it. I'm looking for Colonel Hartley's office, Claire said. Well, Colonel Hartley is in a briefing right now, the private said. You want to wait? How long on? How long? I don't know, maybe an hour. Claire pulled out a notepad. Is there somewhere I can set up in the meantime? The private stared at her for a moment as if this was a trick question. I can find you a conference room. That would be fine, she said. And that was how Claire Morgan's assignment at Fort Liberty began, alone in a conference room with a cold cup of coffee that someone had left behind, reviewing classified documents about security failures that had cost the United States government nearly $40 million in compromised intelligence assets over the previous 16 months. She read for 2 hours without stopping. By the time Colonel Hartley finally appeared at the door, she had already filled 12 pages of her notepad with observations, questions, and a preliminary assessment that would take most analysts a week to compile. Colonel Hartley was a man in his early 50s with the tight, controlled energy of someone who had been managing difficult situations for a long time and had developed a finely calibrated radar for sensing which problems were serious and which ones were noise. He shook Claire's hand, sat down across from her, and said, I apologize for the wait. How was your drive down? Fine, she said. Colonel, before we get into pleasantries, I need to ask you about something I found in the incident reports. He raised an eyebrow. You've already been through the incident reports. I've been here 2 hours, she said simply. He looked at the notepad in front of her. He looked at the stack of documents she had clearly processed. He looked back at her face and something shifted slightly in his expression. Not much, but enough. Ask your question, he said. The third breach, she said. March 14th. The report says the security failure was attributed to a software malfunction in the Eastern Perimeter monitoring system. But the secondary log shows manual override activity 17 minutes before the breach was logged. That means someone inside the base knew what was happening before it happened. She paused. The report doesn't address that. Why? Colonel Hartley was quiet for a moment. That's a sensitive area, he said. I understand that, Claire said, but it's also the central question I'm here to investigate. If there's a reason that detail was excluded from the report, I need to know what that reason is. He studied her for a long moment, then he nodded slowly. There were concerns about the scope of the investigation, he said carefully. Some of the officers involved in reviewing the breach had connections to the personnel who were logged as active during that window. Claire wrote something in her notepad. So the investigation was narrowed to protect someone. I wouldn't characterize it that way. How would you characterize it? He didn't answer immediately. I would say, he said finally, that the investigation reached the conclusions it was able to reach given the constraints it was operating under. Claire looked up from her notes. Colonel Hartley, I've been sent here because those constraints produced 4 more breaches after that report was filed. Whatever was protected in March is still active, and it's still causing damage. She closed her notepad. I'm going to need access to everything. Not the summary reports, everything. There was a silence in the room that lasted long enough to feel deliberate. I'll arrange it, he said. Today, please, she said. He blinked. Something about the directness of it clearly caught him off guard. People didn't usually talk to Colonel Hartley that way, and the look on his face made it clear that he was deciding something in that moment, some internal calculation about who this woman was and how to handle her. Whatever he decided, he nodded. Today, he agreed. She thanked him and he left, and she was alone again with her notepad in the cold conference room and the quiet hum of a bass that had no idea she was already pulling threads on a problem that ran much deeper than anyone had officially admitted. She had been at Fort Liberty for exactly 4 days when she first encountered Major Ryan Whitmore. He walked into the Situation Room where Claire was reviewing surveillance logs with 2 of the base's junior analysts, and his entrance was the kind of entrance that certain men had perfected over decades of operating inside environments where rank meant everything. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that tended to rearrange the energy in whatever room he entered. His uniform was immaculate. His posture was the posture of a man who had never once in his professional life questioned whether he belonged somewhere. He looked around the room. His gaze landed on Claire for a moment and then slid off her with the kind of indifference that is actually its own form of dismissal. He turned to one of the analysts. Sergeant Reyes, what's the status on the Eastern Corridor assessment? Sergeant Reyes, who had been mid-sentence explaining something to Claire about the log inconsistencies, stopped talking and snapped his attention to Whitmore. We're about halfway through, sir. Ms. Morgan has identified some anomalies we're working through. Whitmore turned back to Claire, slowly, as if he'd only just remembered she existed. Ms. Morgan, he said, not a question, not a greeting, just the name delivered with a particular inflection that managed to convey everything he thought about her in 2 words. Major, she said, you're the consultant. I am. He nodded once. And you're finding anomalies. Several, she said, including one that suggests the March breach wasn't a software issue. There was deliberate human interference with the monitoring system. The logs show a pattern that's consistent with what, he said. His voice was patient in the way that is not actually patient at all. It was the voice of someone waiting for you to finish saying something incorrect so they can explain why you're wrong. With someone who knew the system's blind spots, she said. Someone who had worked with this infrastructure long enough to know exactly which window of time the automated verification would skip. He smiled, not warmly. Ms. Morgan, these are trained soldiers. They don't go through security systems like hackers in a movie. Whatever you're seeing in those logs, there's a simple technical explanation. I've ruled out the technical explanations, she said. Have you? Yes. He looked at the 2 analysts in the room. He looked at their faces, which had adopted the careful, neutral expression of people who didn't want to be caught taking sides. Then he looked back at Claire. I'm going to be honest with you, he said, because I think honesty serves everyone better than politeness in this environment. I've seen consultants come through here before. They look at data, they find patterns, they write reports, and then they leave, and the people who actually live and work here are left dealing with the mess that comes from half-understood conclusions drawn by people who don't know the context. Claire said nothing. I have 37 soldiers under my command, he continued. I know every single one of them. I know their histories, I know their capabilities, and I can tell you with confidence that whatever you think you found in those logs, it is not what you think it is. She waited until she was certain he was finished. Then she said, with respect, Major, the confidence you have in your personnel is admirable, but the logs don't care about confidence. They care about patterns. And the pattern I'm looking at right now has a human fingerprint on it that didn't come from a software glitch. She held his gaze steadily. I'm not here to embarrass anyone. I'm here because people's safety was compromised and the root cause was never properly identified. If your personnel are not involved, the investigation will confirm that. But it has to be a real investigation, not a protected one. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Not anger? Not yet. Something cooler than anger. A kind of evaluation, the kind of look you give something when you're deciding how much of a problem it's going to be. Do what you need to do, he said finally, and walked out. Sergeant Reyes let out a breath so small it barely qualified as a sound. The other analyst, a young woman named Corporal Stanton, kept her eyes very carefully on her screen. Claire turned back to the logs and kept working. The thing about Fort Liberty was that it had its own ecosystem, the way all military bases do, a self-contained world with its own hierarchies and loyalties, and unspoken rules about who mattered and who didn't. And in that ecosystem, Whitmore was at the top of the food chain in a way that Colonel Hartley technically outranked him, but practically didn't quite manage. Whitmore had been at Fort Liberty for 6 years. He had built relationships, earned loyalties, created a network of people who owed him things or believed in him or were simply afraid of what happened when he was unhappy. He was not a corrupt man in the obvious sense. He wasn't stealing money or selling information. He was simply a man who had been powerful for long enough that he had started to believe that his judgment was always correct and that challenges to his judgment were not honest disagreements but personal attacks. Claire had worked with men like him before. She had worked with them in environments where the stakes were much higher than a congressional review in a security assessment. She understood how they thought, what they were afraid of, what made them lash out, and what made them careful. She had learned over many years and in many difficult places that the most dangerous thing you could do with a man like Whitmore was show him that you were not afraid of him. Not because it made his back rion, it never made them back fictional, but because it told him that you were a real threat. And real threats required real responses. She was very careful in those first days to let him believe that she was something less than what she was. She asked questions that sounded uncertain. She made small tactical mistakes in meetings, the kind of mistakes that looked like inexperience, but were actually calibrated to let him believe he understood her level of capability. She accepted dismissals from junior officers without pushing back, noting everything and revealing nothing. The whole time she was building a picture, and the picture was more disturbing than even she had expected. On the 8th day, Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb found her. He was a man in his mid-40s with the weathered look of someone who had spent most of his adult life outdoors doing difficult things and had developed a deep contentment with the fact that most people didn't fully understand what those things were. He appeared at the door of her temporary office, knocked twice, and said, "Ms. Morgan, I heard you've been looking at the march logs." "Come in," she said. He sat down, placed his hands flat on the table, and said, "I was the duty officer the night of the March breach." She looked at him carefully. "I know." He nodded. This didn't surprise him. "Then you know my report matched the official version." It did. "It wasn't accurate," he said. The room was very quiet. Somewhere outside, you could hear the faint sound of a training exercise in progress, the organized chaos of soldiers moving through drills, the distant commands and responses. "Tell me," she said. He took a breath. "I was on the floor at approximately 2200 when I got a call from the monitoring station. The duty sergeant told me the East system was showing a glitch and they were running a manual reset. Standard procedure. I authorized it and logged it. 40 minutes later, the breach was detected." He paused. "But when I went back to review the logs the next morning, the call I received wasn't in the system. There was no record of the call from the monitoring station. The log showed the manual override initiated from a different terminal, a terminal that was supposed to be inactive that night." "Who was logged as the operator on that terminal?" she asked. He looked at her. "Sergeant First Class Webb," she said. "I need you to say it out loud." "The terminal was logged under my credentials," he said, "but I never touched it. I was on the main floor the entire time. I had witnesses. But when I reported the discrepancy to the chain of command, I was told that the investigation had already concluded it was a software anomaly and I should let it go." "Who told you to let it go?" He pressed his lips together. "Major Whitmore." Claire wrote nothing. She didn't need to write it down. She had already known on some level for 3 days. The shape of what she was looking at had been becoming clearer for days. What Webb was telling her wasn't a revelation. It was confirmation. "Are you willing to put this in a formal statement?" she asked. "That's why I'm here," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "This will not be easy," she said. "Once this statement exists, everything changes. You understand that?" "Yes," he said. "You've thought about this." "I've thought about nothing else for 7 months," he said. "I reported what I saw through the proper channels and I was told to drop it. 4 more breaches happened after I dropped it. I'm done dropping it." She nodded slowly, reached into her briefcase and pulled out a formal statement form, slid it across the table to him. He picked up the pen she offered and he started writing. She was careful about what she did with the statement. She didn't file it immediately. She didn't mention it to Colonel Hartley. She didn't let anything change in her behavior or her routine that would signal to anyone watching that something significant had shifted. She filed it in a secure digital archive that existed outside the base's internal network, a system accessible only through her own encrypted credentials on a server that had nothing to do with Fort Liberty's infrastructure. And then she kept working. She interviewed 3 more soldiers over the following week. 2 of them confirmed pieces of Webb's account from different angles. The third gave her something she hadn't expected: a name, a contractor who had worked at Fort Liberty during the period of the breaches, a man who had left the base 2 weeks after the March breach with a formal clearance from Major Whitmore's office. She was sitting in the temporary office at 11 o'clock at night when she found the contractor's file and realized that the clearance paperwork had a signature that didn't match the officer who was supposed to have signed it. She sat very still for a moment. Then she took a photograph of the document with her personal encrypted device and sent it to a secure account. The response came back within minutes. Just 4 words from a contact she trusted completely. 4 words that told her this was bigger than a security assessment. 4 words that told her the reason those breaches had never been properly investigated was because someone very close to them had been making sure they wouldn't be. The 4 words were, "Don't move, I'm coming." So no. The next morning, Whitmore came to her office. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door, stood in the frame, and looked at her with an expression that had changed from the cool assessment of their first meeting to something harder. "I've been hearing things," he said. "About," she asked. "About you asking questions. Not the questions you were authorized to ask. Specific questions about personnel decisions and chain of command." He came into the office without being invited and sat down in the chair across from her. "That's outside your scope, Miss Morgan. My scope is whatever is relevant to understanding the security failures I was sent here to investigate," she said. "Your scope," he said carefully and precisely, "is defined by your authorization paperwork. I've read it. It does not include interviewing my soldiers without my knowledge." "I didn't interview anyone without their consent," she said. "That's not what I said." "It's what's relevant," she said. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I want to be very direct with you," he said. "There are people on this base who will tell you things. Not because those things are true, but because they're unhappy with decisions that have been made, and they see an outside consultant as an opportunity to cause problems. You're being used. And if you file a report based on grievances dressed up as evidence, you will have done serious harm to this unit and to these soldiers for no justifiable reason." Claire looked at him for a long time. "Major Whitmore," she said, "I've been doing this work for a long time. I know the difference between a grievance and a pattern. What I'm looking at right now is a pattern." She folded her hands on the desk. "And the pattern is going to end up in my report, every piece of it." He stood up. The movement was controlled, deliberate, but something underneath it was not. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said. He looked at her one more time and walked out. She worked late every night for the rest of that week. She was careful. She was methodical. She backed everything up. She kept nothing important on the base's systems. But she was aware in the careful, alert way that you become aware of certain things when you have spent years in environments where awareness is survival, that something was shifting around her. Small things, a file she had left in a specific position in her briefcase that was in a slightly different position when she returned to the room. A conversation that stopped when she walked into a hallway. A look exchanged between 2 soldiers that ended the moment they noticed her noticing. She said nothing about any of this. She changed the position of nothing. She altered no routines. She simply filed the observations in the part of her mind that she had trained over many years to hold information without acting on it until the right moment. Because that was the thing about the kind of work Claire Morgan had been doing since she was 24 years old, and had first walked into a briefing room in a country she wasn't allowed to name and been told that she had 24 hours to identify a threat that 3 teams of trained professionals had failed to find, though. The work was never about being the loudest voice in the room. The work was about being the last person standing when everything else had fallen apart. And she had been the last person standing before, more times than she would ever be allowed to talk about, more times than she had ever wanted to count. On a Thursday evening, 14 days into her assignment, Sergeant Reyes found her in the hallway outside the records office and pulled her to the side with a look on his face that she had not seen from him before. He was a careful young man, measured and professional, and the look he wore now was the look of someone who had crossed an internal threshold and wasn't sure yet if they were on the right side of it. "Ms. Morgan," he said low and fast, "I need to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "There's a meeting tonight, not official. Major Whitmore called some people together." He paused. "He's been asking questions about you. Personal questions. About your background, your credentials. He called someone at the Department of Defense this afternoon." She absorbed this without any visible reaction. "What's he asking for?" "I think he's trying to find something he can use to challenge your authorization," Reyes said. "He told Lieutenant Garza this morning that he thinks you were sent here to manufacture a problem that doesn't exist. He used the word planted. He said someone planted you here to build a mace against specific personnel." She nodded slowly. "Ms. Morgan," Reyes said, and there was something in his voice now that was not quite fear, but was in the same neighborhood. "Is any of that true?" She looked at him. "Do you know why I was sent here, Sergeant?" "To investigate the breaches," he said. "That's right. And in 14 days, I have found evidence of at least 3 significant security failures that were not caused by software malfunctions. Evidence of at least 1 personnel decision that may have been used to move a compromised contractor off this base before an investigation could reach him, and evidence that a formal witness account was suppressed through informal pressure from within this unit." She let that settle for a moment. "Does any of that sound like manufacturing a problem that doesn't exist?" Reyes was quiet. He looked at his shoes, then he looked back at her. "No," he said. "Then you have your answer," she said. "Thank you for telling me about the meeting. Now please go about your evening as if this conversation didn't happen." He nodded, walked away, didn't look back. Claire stood alone in the hallway for a moment, with the sound of the bass settling into its evening rhythms around her, and she thought about the 4 words she'd received 4 nights ago, and the contact who had said they were coming, and the timeline she was working against. Then she turned and walked back to her office. There was still work to do. The things she had not told Sergeant Reyes, the things she had not told Colonel Hartley, the things she had not told anyone at Fort Liberty, was that the call she had received from her contact in response to the contractor's file had also included a piece of information that changed the shape of everything she thought she was investigating. The contractor the man Whitmore had cleared with a forged signature 2 weeks after the March breach had surfaced in a separate investigation, run by a different office in a completely different part of the government. He had surfaced as a known intermediary, a man who moved between worlds that were not supposed to touch each other. And the evidence in that separate investigation pointed back to Fort Liberty, back to the period of the breaches, back with a precision that could not be coincidence to a window of time that overlapped almost perfectly with the dates on Major Ryan Whitmore's command log. This was no longer just a security assessment, and Claire was no longer just a consultant, but she needed more time. She needed 3 more days to pull the final pieces together, to build a record solid enough that it couldn't be dismantled, to document everything in a way that would survive whatever came next. 3 days. She didn't get them. No. Because on the second day after Rhea's warning in the early afternoon, her office door opened without a knock, and Major Ryan Whitmore walked in with 2 soldiers behind him. And behind those soldiers was a man she didn't recognize, civilian 50s carrying a briefcase and wearing the specific kind of unremarkable suit that certain government employees wore when they wanted to appear like they weren't from the government. Whitmore looked at her with an expression that was for the first time entirely undisguised. "Miss Morgan," he said, "I'm going to need you to close your laptop and step out of this office." She looked at the man in the suit. then back at Whitmore. On whose authority, she said. Whitmore placed a document on her desk. She looked at it without touching it. It was a formal suspension notice for her investigation signed by someone 2 levels above Colonel Hartley. She looked at it for a long moment. She thought about the secure server outside the base network. She thought about the 12 pages of notes from her first day. She thought about Webb's statement in the photographs of the contractor's file and the pattern in the logs that she could reconstruct from memory alone if she needed to. Because she had that kind of memory, the kind that was trained and tested and had never once failed her when it mattered. She closed her laptop. She stood up. She picked up her briefcase. She looked at Major Ryan Whitmore with the calm expression that he had been misreading since the first day she arrived, and she said very quietly, "You should have let me finish." And she walked out. She was 3 steps down the hallway when she heard the man in the suit say behind her to Whitmore, "Who is she?" And she heard Whitmore say with complete and total confidence, "Nobody important, just a consultant." She kept walking. She did not smile, but she came very close because the man in the suit, she now understood with absolute certainty, was not working with Whitmore. He was watching Whitmore, and he had just asked the right question. The next question would be hers to answer. And when she answered it, everything in that building was going to change. She walked out of that building with her briefcase, her laptop, and absolutely nothing else showing on her face. Not anger, not fear, not the kind of shaken, rattled energy that most people carry when they've just been publicly humiliated by a man twice their size in front of 40 witnesses. She walked the way she always walked, even, measured, like someone who had already calculated every possible outcome of what just happened and was simply moving toward the one she intended. The suspension document was real. The signature on it was real. Someone 2 levels above Colonel Hartley had signed off on pausing her investigation, and that meant someone 2 levels above Colonel Hartley had been contacted, persuaded or pressured by a person who had access to that level of the chain of command and had used that access in the last 48 hours. She knew exactly one person at Fort Liberty with that kind of reach. She reached her temporary housing unit, locked the door, sat down on the edge of the bed, and opened her encrypted personal device. She had 3 messages waiting. The first was from Colonel Hartley. It said, "I'm sorry I wasn't call me." The second was from a number she recognized but hadn't expected to hear from yet. It said only "accelerating timeline. Need you out of there by 1800. The third was from an address she didn't recognize. It contained no text, just a photograph. A photograph of a document she had never seen before but recognized immediately for what it was. She stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she called the number from the second message. It rang once. "Tell me you're already out," said the voice on the other end. It was a woman's voice, clipped and precise, with the particular economy of someone who had spent years saying important things in the fewest possible words. "I'm out of the building," Claire said, "not out of the situation." "Claire, Diana, I need 48 more hours." "You don't have 48 hours. You may not have 8 hours." The suspension order was a warning shot. Whatever you found, they know you found it, and they are moving faster than we anticipated. A pause. "How much do you have secured?" "Secured everything material," Claire said. "But there's a document that just came through on an address I don't recognize. A photograph of what looks like a secondary communication log between Whitmore and the contractor. If that's authentic." "It's authentic," Diana said immediately. Claire stopped. "You sent it?" "It came to us through a separate channel 2 hours ago. Someone on the inside, someone who's been sitting on it and decided the suspension order was the moment to move." Another pause, shorter this time. "Claire, that document connects Whitmore directly to the 3rd and 4th breach. Not circumstantially, directly. Timestamps, message, content, authorization codes. If you can get that into a formal chain of evidence before they shut the channel down. I need to be inside the base to do that." "I know. They just suspended my access." "I know that too." The silence between them was the silence of 2 people who had navigated situations like this before and understood that what came next required a decision that couldn't be made cautiously. "There's someone still inside who can help me," Claire said. "Webb." "No, Webb's already exposed. Someone else." She thought of Reyes, the way he had looked at her in the hallway, the threshold he had already crossed. "Someone who came to me, who made a choice." That's a risk, Diana said. Everything from this point forward is a risk, Claire said. What's the alternative? I walk away, and this stays buried for another 7 months while more breaches happen. Silence. You have until 1800, Diana said. After that, I cannot hold the window open. Whatever you have needs to be transmitted and verified before then, or it doesn't exist in any form that matters. Understood. Claire, the voice shifted slightly, just slightly, towards something that was not entirely professional. Be careful. Whitmore knows something went wrong today. He's not going to just sit and wait. I know, Claire said. He's not a patient man. No, she agreed. He's not. She ended the call, sat still for exactly 10 seconds, and then stood up and started moving. She had 6 hours, and she had a plan that depended entirely on a young sergeant named Reyes making the same choice a second time in a much higher stakes moment with much less time to think about it. She was betting he would. She was betting on the look she had seen on his face in the hallway. The look of someone who had already made up his mind and was just waiting for someone to tell him it was the right decision. She had been reading people in high-pressure situations for 15 years. She was very rarely wrong. She was about to find out if this was one of the rare times. She sent Reyes a single message through a secondary secure channel she had set up on his personal device during their second conversation. Something she had done quietly and without explanation, telling him only that if he ever needed to reach her outside the base system, this was how. The message said, I need the records room, side entrance, 30 minutes, come alone, tell no one. She pressed send, then she put the device in her pocket and went to do the hardest part. The hardest part was not getting back onto the base. She still had a physical access badge that had not yet been flagged in the system. Suspension orders move faster through the chain of command than they move through the administrative processing queue. She had at least a 2-hour window, possibly more, before her badge would stop working. The hardest part was walking back through that gate, knowing that somewhere on that base, Major Ryan Whitmore was in a room with people he trusted, and those people were making decisions about how to handle the problems she represented. She had been a problem before. She knew what it felt like to be the thing that powerful people needed to go away. She also knew that the people who were most aggressive about making problems go away were almost always the people with the most to lose if those problems didn't. That knowledge was not comforting exactly, but it was clarifying. She walked to the gate, swiped her badge. The light turned green. She went in. She moved through the base with the same measured pace she always used. The same route she took every day, making no visible adjustments to her usual pattern. She passed 3 soldiers she recognized. All 3 acknowledged her with the kind of nod that suggested they had heard something but weren't sure what to do about it. She nodded back, kept walking. She was 4 buildings from the records room when she heard her name. Ms. Morgan? She turned. Corporal Stanton was standing 10 feet behind her, the young woman who had kept her eyes carefully on her screen during Claire's first confrontation with Whitmore. She was standing alone, which was either very good or very bad. Corporal, Claire said. Stanton glanced left, then right, then took 2 quick steps forward. She held something out, a folded piece of paper. Someone left this on my desk 20 minutes ago, she said in a low, fast voice. No name on it, but it was addressed to you. Claire took it, opened it, read it. It was a handwritten list of names, 6 names. Beside each name, a date and a 3-digit code she didn't immediately recognize. But she recognized 2 of the names. One of them was the contractor Whitmore had cleared with the forged signature. The other was a name she had not encountered anywhere in the Fort Liberty investigation. A name that belonged, as far as she knew, to an entirely separate case in an entirely separate part of the country. The fact that both names were on the same piece of paper written by the same hand told her something that she needed several seconds to fully process. Where's the person who left this? She asked. I don't know, Stanton said. It was on my desk when I came back from the briefing room. I was only gone 15 minutes. Claire looked at the list again. The 3-digit codes. She understood them now. They were authorization codes, the same format as the codes in the secondary communication log that Diana had sent her an hour ago. Corporal Stanton, Claire said quietly, I need you to go back to your desk. Do not mention this to anyone. If anyone asks about me, you haven't seen me today. Ms. Morgan, what's happening? Stanton asked, and her voice had the specific quality of someone who was starting to understand, that they were standing at the edge of something much larger than they had signed up for. "You're doing the right thing," Claire said. "That's what's happening. Go back to your desk." Stanton looked at her for one more second. Then she turned and walked back the way she had come. She didn't look back, which Claire noted with something close to respect. The young ones who didn't look back were always the ones who had the real stuff underneath the uncertainty. Claire put the list in her briefcase and kept moving. Reyes was already at the side entrance of the records room when she arrived. He was standing with the stiff, deliberately casual posture of someone who is trying very hard to look like they are not doing something unusual, which meant he was doing a decent impression of someone who had not done this kind of thing before. "You came," she said. "You said come alone," he said. "I came alone. Did anyone see you?" "I don't think so. I told Sergeant Torres I was going to supply. That bought me maybe 20 minutes before anyone notices." He looked at her. "What do you need?" "The secondary log archive," she said. "Physical archive, not the digital system. The binders in the restricted cabinet in the back room. Specifically the logs from March 7th through March 21st. He stared at her. "Those are restricted access. I'd need an officer." "I know," she said. "Can you get me in soon?" I didn't answer immediately. She watched him process it, the calculation happening visibly on his face, the weighing of risk against something else. The something else that had brought him to this side entrance in the first place. "If someone finds out," he said. "I know," she said again. "This could end my career." "It could," she said honestly. "Or it could be the thing you did that you're most proud of for the rest of it." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to tell you this isn't a risk. I'm going to tell you that the risk of doing nothing's already playing out. 4 more breaches, Reyes. 4. And a witness statement that got buried. And a contractor who walked out of here carrying something he shouldn't have had, cleared by a man who forged the signature that let him go. That's what doing nothing looks like." She paused. "What do you want to do?" He looked at his hands. He looked at the door. He looked back at her. "I have the override code for the restricted cabinet," he said quietly. "Officers leave them with senior NCOs for emergency access. I have Whitmore's." The weight of that particular detail settled over both of them for a moment. "Has he changed it recently?" she asked. "Not in the 6 months I've had it," Reyes said. "Then let's go," she said. I went in first. She followed 20 seconds later. The records room was empty except for the hum of the ventilation system and the particular institutional quiet of a room full of things that weren't supposed to leave. Reyes moved to the restricted cabinet at the back. His hands were steady, she noticed. That was a good sign. The people whose hands shook were the ones who hadn't fully committed. His hands were steady because some part of him had already decided probably days ago. Maybe the night she had stood in the hallway and told him the pattern she was looking at was real. The cabinet opened. She pulled the March binders, sat down on the floor with them because there was no table cleared and the floor was faster, and started photographing pages with her encrypted device. Systematically, page by page. Every page that covered the window from March 7th through March 21st. Reyes stood by the door and watched the hallway through the narrow window. "How much time?" she asked. 15 minutes, he said, maybe. She photographed faster. She was on the 3rd binder when she found it. It was a single entry, 6 lines long, logged at 22:17 on March 14th. The date and time that Webb had described. The manual override. The terminal that was supposed to be inactive. And next to the terminal identifier in the authorization column, a 6-character code. She recognized the format of that code. She had seen the same format 4 hours ago in the photograph Diana had sent her. She photographed the page twice. Then she photographed the surrounding pages for context. Then she closed the binder, replaced all 3 in the exact positions she had found them, and stood up. "Done," she said. Reyes let out a breath. "We need to go." "Separately," she said. "You first. Give it 2 minutes." He looked at her. There was something on his face that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite pride and was somewhere in the complicated space between 2 things that felt contradictory but were actually part of the same thing. "Ms. Morgan," he said, "what you're doing? I've been watching you for 2 weeks. The way you work, the way you handle these people." He paused. "You're not just a consultant, are you?" She looked at him for a moment. "Go back to supplies," she said quietly. "You were never here." He held her gaze for 1 more second. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who had gotten the answer he expected, even if it wasn't the answer he'd asked for. and he went out the door. She waited 2 minutes, then she followed. She was 3 minutes from the exit, moving fast when she turned a corner and walked directly into Major Ryan Whitmore. I was not alone. He had two soldiers with him, both of them larger than her, both of them standing in the loose, ready posture of men who had been told to be somewhere specific for a specific purpose. Whitmore looked at her. Something crossed his face. Not surprise. He had expected this. He had known or suspected she would come back onto the base, and he had positioned himself to intercept her. The efficiency of it told her that someone had flagged her badge entry. She had miscalculated the administrative processing time. She had thought she had 2 hours. She had had less than one. "Ms. Morgan," he said with the specific satisfaction of a man who believes he has won. "Your access was suspended this morning." "I'm aware," she said. "Then you understand that you are currently in violation of the suspension order." "I do," she said. "Then you understand that I am authorized to escort you off this base immediately." He nodded to the two soldiers. "Corporal James, Private Herrera, please assist Ms. Morgan to the exit." The two soldiers moved toward her, not aggressively, but definitively. The movement of people executing an order they had been given with confidence by a man they trusted completely. Claire did not move. She stood very still and looked at Whitmore past the shoulders of the two soldiers moving toward her. She had 3 seconds, maybe 4, before this became a physical situation, and she needed to make a choice about how to handle those 3 seconds. She made it. "Major Whitmore," she said clearly, and at a volume that carried. "Before these men touch me, I want you to know that everything I found in the march logs has been transmitted and verified to an external secure server. The photographs of the secondary communication log, the names, the authorization codes, the physical archive entries from March 14th. She paused. "Everything you tried to bury is already outside this building." The two soldiers stopped, not because she had told them to, because something in Whitmore's face had changed in a way that made people instinctively pause. "You're bluffing," he said. "Call it," she said. Silence. She watched him calculate. She watched the confidence in his expression do something complicated, the micro-collapse of a certainty encountering the first real doubt. She had seen that look before, on men who believed they were in control of a situation and were only now registering that the situation might not share that belief. "Even if that were true," he said, and his voice had changed slightly. The bravado was still there, but it was working harder now. "It wouldn't matter. You collected that evidence in violation of your suspension order. It's inadmissible, it's tainted, it's worthless." "Evidence collected before the suspension order was transmitted before the suspension order," she said, "and the physical archive photograph was taken from a restricted cabinet using a code provided to me by an authorized NCO during a period when my badge access was still valid." She watched his face. "I understand the argument you're trying to make. I want you to understand that I thought about it before I walked back onto this base." The silence this time lasted longer. One of the soldiers, Corporal James, was looking at Whitmore with the expression of someone who is waiting for instructions and is starting to become uncomfortable with the waiting. "Sir," James said quietly. Whitmore didn't respond immediately. He was looking at Claire with an expression that had completed its transformation. The satisfaction was completely gone. What had replaced it was something rawer. Not fear exactly, but the first signal of it. The first acknowledgement somewhere beneath the discipline and the rank and the years of being the most powerful person in every room that he might have made a miscalculation. "Escort her out," he said finally. His voice was controlled, but something underneath it had gone tight. The soldiers moved toward her again. She let them. She walked between them to the exit without resistance, without comment, without looking back at Whitmore. She could feel his gaze on her back the entire length of the hallway. She did not turn around. She walked out through the main gate for the second time that day. Her badge beeped, active. The administrative flag had not yet caught up with the physical system. She kept walking. She was 2 blocks off base, sitting in the same gray government sedan that had brought her here 2 weeks ago, when her encrypted device lit up with a message from Diana. Received and verified. All of it. The archive photographs match the secondary log timestamps. Authorization codes are confirmed. The 3rd and 4th breach connect directly to the same source. "We have enough." A pause represented in the message by 3 dots that came and went before the next line appeared. "There's something else. The list of names, the one delivered through Stanton. We ran the 6 character codes. 4 of them matched communication logs from a separate ongoing investigation. Claire, this is bigger than Fort Liberty. This is so much bigger than Fort Liberty. She read the message twice. She thought about the man in the suit who had come with Whitmore that morning, the man who had asked who she was. She thought about his face when Whitmore had said, "Nobody important." She thought about the specific expression that had crossed the man's features in response to that answer. Not agreement, not dismissal, something else entirely, something that, now reading Diana's message, she understood she had been correct to notice and file away. She typed back, "The man who came with Whitmore this morning. Civilian, 50s, unremarkable suit. Who is he?" The response came back in under a minute, faster than it should have, which told her Diana had already looked. "His name is Gerald Foss. He's a contractor liaison for a government office that officially does not conduct domestic investigations." A pause, another set of 3 dots. "He's been watching Whitmore for 4 months. Claire, Whitmore isn't the top of this. He's a link. And Foss came to Fort Liberty today because someone told him the investigation was about to reach the link." Claire sat with that for a moment. "Someone told him," she typed back. "Not Whitmore." No, Whitmore doesn't know Foss is watching him. As far as Whitmore is concerned, Foss is a friendly who helped him get the suspension order signed. But Foss isn't friendly. "Foss is the reason the suspension order exists," Diana wrote. "He needed you out of the building so Whitmore would feel safe enough to make his next move. Whatever that move is, Foss intends to document it." She understood it then, all of it, the complete architecture of it. The suspension order wasn't meant to protect Whitmore. It was meant to provoke him, to give him enough confidence that the threat had been neutralized, that he would do something that could be observed. Which meant that every move she had made today, going back onto the base, the confrontation in the hallway, the 2 soldiers in Whitmore's face in the moment of doubt, everything had happened inside a surveillance window that Gerald Foss had deliberately opened. She had walked back onto that base believing she was the one executing a plan. And she had been. Her plan had been real, and the evidence she had transmitted was real, and the documents were verified and secure. But she had also been, without knowing it, the thing that drew Whitmore out of his careful defensive posture and made him visible. She thought about the 5 words she had said to him that morning, the words that had drained the color from his face. She had said, "I know what you did." She had meant it as a statement of fact, a warning, a signal that the walls were closing. But Whitmore had heard it as an ultimatum, and ultimatums made men like Whitmore react instead of calculate. That reaction was what Foss had been waiting for. She typed one more message to Diana. "Is Foss going to move on Whitmore today?" "He's waiting for one more thing," Diana wrote back. "He needs Whitmore to make contact. There's a communication they have been monitoring, a channel they believe Whitmore uses to pass information. They need him to use it. He hasn't as long as your investigation was active. You were too close. The risk was too high." "But now he thinks I'm gone," Claire said. "Yes. How long will he wait?" "Foss thinks tonight," Diana wrote. "Whitmore is scared enough to reach out and confident enough to think the threat is past. That's the window." Claire looked out the window of the sedan at the base entrance she had walked through twice today. At the gate, in the guard, in the ordinary institutional architecture of a place that from the outside looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. "Diana," she typed, "I need to know something. The person who sent the list through Stanton, the person who's been sitting on that information and chose today to move. Who is it?" The response took longer this time, long enough that she had started to wonder if Diana was going to answer at all. "Then you're going to find out, but not from me, not yet. When this is over, that person is going to tell you themselves." She stared at the message for a long time. Someone inside Fort Liberty had been watching Whitmore longer than anyone else. Someone who had access to the kind of documentation that took months to compile. Someone who had stayed silent through 4 breaches and had chosen today, specifically today, the day Claire Morgan walked out of that building for the 2nd time at the moment to hand over the thing they had been holding. She thought about who she had met in the last 2 weeks. She thought about the ones who had looked at her the way people look at someone they're trying to decide whether to trust. She thought about the ones who had been just slightly too careful, just slightly too precise in what they said and didn't say. She thought about Colonel Hartley's first message. the apology, the admission that he hadn't been consulted. She thought about something he had said in their very first meeting, which she had filed away and not yet retrieved. He had said, "I'll arrange it." He had said it about giving her access. But the speed with which he had said it and the way he had looked at her when he said it, as if the request itself was something he had been waiting for someone to make. She thought about that now with entirely new context. And she thought not him, not Hartley, someone else. Someone who had been at Fort Liberty longer than Hartley. Someone who had watched the breaches happen from a position close enough to see the details and far enough from Whitmore to still be trusted. Webb. She had assumed Webb was the person who had simply finally come forward because she had given him the opening. But what if Webb had done more than give a statement? What if Webb had been the one who made sure Stanton's desk was accessible? Who knew which corporal could be trusted to deliver a piece of paper without asking too many questions? She had a lot of questions, and she was no longer officially on the investigation. But the evidence was secure. The transmissions were verified. The window was open and Gerald Foss was watching, and somewhere on the other side of that gate, Major Ryan Whitmore believed the threat had been neutralized. She sat with all of that for a long, quiet moment. Then she picked up her encrypted device one more time and sent a final message. Not to Diana. To the number she had given Reyes. She sent it knowing that he would read it and knowing that what she was asking him was not a small thing. She sent it because she had been right about him in the hallway, and she trusted herself to be right about him now. It said, "You asked me if I was more than a consultant. I'm going to tell you the truth. Watch the base communications tonight, all channels. If anything gets logged from Whitmore's office after 2100, don't touch it. Don't delete it, and don't let anyone near it. Just preserve it. That's all I need. Just preserve it." She put the device in her pocket. She looked at the gate. She thought about Whitmore sitting in his office right now, believing the problem had been escorted off the base. She thought about the 5 words she had said to him that morning. Then she thought about the 5 words she should have said instead. Not a warning, not a signal. A simple statement of fact that she had known from the moment she walked onto this base and would still be true long after tonight was over. The words were, "You were never in control." He didn't know that yet. By tomorrow morning, he would. Part 3, the night everything broke open. The message to Reyes sent at 16:42. She knew because she checked the timestamp twice the way she always checked things twice, the habit of a person who had learned in the most unforgiving classrooms imaginable, that the difference between a detail you verified and a detail you assumed could be measured in lives. She sat in the sedan for another 4 minutes after sending it, not because she was uncertain, because she was giving herself 4 minutes to be certain that she wasn't uncertain. That was a distinction she had learned to make a long time ago in a different country, in a different kind of danger, when a mentor she had trusted completely had told her that the most dangerous moment in any operation was not the moment of maximum threat, but the moment when you believed the hard part was over. The hard part was not over. She got out of the sedan and walked to the motel 3 blocks from the base where she had kept a secondary room under a name that was not Claire Morgan, paid in cash, checked in under a driver's license, that was real and legal and belonged to a version of her identity that existed in a system very few people had access to. She had learned to do this not because she was paranoid, but because she had been in enough situations to know that preparation and paranoia looked identical from the outside and completely different from the inside. Inside the room, she set up her laptop connected to an encrypted VPN that routed through 3 servers in 3 different countries and opened the secure channel to Diana. "Talk to me," she typed. Diana's response came in under 30 seconds. "Whitmore hasn't moved yet. He's still in his office. Foss has eyes on the building. We're watching all outbound communication channels from the base, military and civilian bandwidth both." A pause. "There's something else." Webb came forward again. Claire's hands stopped moving over the keyboard. "When?" she typed. "An hour ago. He went directly to Colonel Hartley. Didn't go through Whitmore's chain, went around it completely." Another pause longer. "He gave Hartley a second statement, a fuller one. It includes something he didn't tell you." She felt the familiar pull of a story that was not finished being what she thought it was. What didn't he tell me? In March, the night of the breach, Webb received the call from the monitoring station. He told you that. What he didn't tell you was that before he authorized the manual override, he asked for a confirmation code. Standard protocol. The person on the other end gave him a code. Diana's messages were coming faster now. That code was not the duty officer's code. It was a command-level override code. The kind of code that only 4 people on this base have access to. Claire already knew where this was going. She typed it anyway. Which 4 people? Colonel Hartley, the base executive officer, the operations director. Diana stopped. The 3 dots appeared and disappeared twice before the final line came through. And Major Ryan Whitmore. The room was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the faint sound of evening traffic, the ordinary sounds of a world that didn't know what was happening 3 blocks away inside a secure military facility. Webb gave the person the benefit of the doubt, Claire typed. He assumed it was a legitimate command-level action. Yes, he authorized the override. He logged it as a software maintenance procedure because that's what the person on the phone told him it was. And then 6 hours later, the breach happened. And when the investigation started, someone had already altered the logs to remove the call and replace it with a false entry under Webb's credentials. Another pause. Webb knew from the morning after the breach, he knew that whatever happened that night had used his authorization and his name to cover it. And he also knew that the only person who would have had a reason to use a command-level override code and then bury the evidence was someone who understood exactly how the investigation would proceed. Someone who had been through enough internal investigations to know which threads would be pulled and which ones would be left alone. Claire said, yes. She sat back. The picture was complete now in a way it hadn't been even an hour ago. Whitmore hadn't just exploited the system. He had engineered a situation in which the system would investigate itself and find nothing, because he had built the nothing deliberately with the precision of someone who understood every procedural step of the review process and had positioned evidence to stop the review at exactly the right point. That wasn't the work of a reckless man. That wasn't arrogance without intelligence behind it. That was the work of someone who had been planning this for a long time. Diana, she typed slowly. How long has Foss been watching him? Officially 4 months. Unofficially. The dots appeared and stayed for longer this time. The office Foss works for opened a preliminary file on Whitmore 14 months ago, before the first breach. She read that twice. Then she closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, the way she did when she needed to restructure a picture that had just shown her it was much larger than its frame. They knew something was coming, she said, before it started. They had a thread, not enough to move on, but enough to watch. And they watched 4 breaches happen. They were building a case, Diana said. Claire, I know how that sounds. It sounds like $40 million in compromised intelligence and whatever those breaches exposed in terms of human assets. And I need to know if people got hurt because an office decided to build a case instead of act. The response took a full minute, long enough that she considered whether Diana was going to answer at all. Then, that question is above my clearance level. I'm sorry. She pressed her palms flat against the table and looked at them for a moment. The question would not be answered tonight, maybe not for a long time. But it existed and it was real, and she filed it in the place where she kept things that needed to be returned to. Then she looked at the clock, 17:14. Less than 5 hours until Diana's window closed. What does Hartley do with Webb's statement? She typed. He's already escalated it. He went over the base executive officer directly to the inspector general's office 30 minutes ago. A pause. He also submitted a formal objection to your suspension order on the grounds that the order was requested by a subject of the investigation. Something moved through her. Not surprise. Recognition. The kind that comes when you have been trying to read someone and the last piece of the reading finally falls into place. Hartley had known longer than she had thought. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to recognize why she was really there. Enough to leave the door open. Enough to say, I'll arrange it in that particular way on the first day and mean something more by it than the words on their surface. He had been waiting for someone to build the record. He couldn't build himself without exposing everything he already knew. She had been that person. And now he was using what she had built to go around the people who had tried to shut her down. Hartley is the inside witness, she said, not a question. He's been documenting Whitmore's decisions for 8 months, Diana confirmed. He couldn't come forward directly. Whitmore had built enough of a case against Hartley's own administrative record to make any complaint from Hartley look retaliatory. He needed an external investigation to reach the same conclusions independently. She thought about the first day, the empty security office, the private who didn't know what to do with her, the hours she had waited alone in the conference room with cold coffee and classified documents. She had assumed the disorganized welcome was bureaucratic indifference. She understood now that it had been deliberate. Hartley had given her space to start reading before anyone could manage what she was allowed to see. "He gave me the files unfiltered," she said. "Yes." He knew I would find the March discrepancy. He was counting on it. She sat with that for a moment. The feeling it produced was complicated, not betrayal exactly. She had been used as a tool, but she had also been trusted as one trusted to do precisely what she was trained to do. And the result was real, regardless of the architecture around it. She thought about something her mentor had told her once years ago. In a different city, in a different situation, where she had discovered that the operation she believed she was running was nested inside a larger operation she hadn't been told about. She had been angry. Her mentor had been patient. Ian had said, "The work is real, even when the context is not what you were told. What you found is still what you found. What you built still holds. Don't let the architecture make you doubt the foundation." She had not thought about that in years. She thought about it now. At 17:31, her encrypted device lit up with a message from Reyes. It said, "Something is wrong. Can you talk?" She called him immediately. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he had been holding the phone. "Talk," she said. "I'm in the communications monitoring station," he said low and fast. "I've been here since your message. I told Sergeant Torres I was running a routine diagnostic on the overnight logging system." His voice was tight, not panicked. Tight. The way a person's voice gets when they are holding something difficult with both hands and trying not to drop it. "20 minutes ago, I picked up an anomaly on one of the restricted channels. An outbound ping on a frequency that's supposed to be inactive." "What time?" she asked. 17:22. She checked the clock. 9 minutes ago. She kept her voice even. "What kind of ping?" "It's not a standard military communication format," Reyes said. "It's a compressed data packet, small, very small. The kind of thing that looks like a calibration signal if you're not looking for it. But I've been looking for it. Can you identify the source terminal?" A pause. She could hear him working the faint sound of keyboard clicks. "It's coming from a terminal in the operations wing," he said. "Building 7, second floor." Another pause. "Mr. Morgan, that's Whitmore's building." She was already on her feet. "Don't touch it," she said. "Don't intercept it. Don't flag it in the system. Let it complete and preserve the full transmission log, including the source terminal identifier and the timestamp." "I know, you said that in your message." Another pause, and this one had a different quality, not the pause of someone working, but the pause of someone who had just noticed something. "There's a second ping," he said. "Same channel, 30 seconds after the first. That's not calibration. Calibration doesn't repeat. This is a two-part handshake." "He's making contact," she said. "He's reaching out to whoever is on the other end of this." "Should I preserve everything?" she said. "All of it, every timestamp, every packet identifier. Can you pull the geographic data from the receiving end?" "Not from here," he said. "The encryption on the outbound would need a decryption key I don't have access to." "That's fine," she said. "The transmission log is enough. The fact of the communication is enough. Can you save it to an external record that exists outside the base's internal archive?" A pause. "I can print it," he said. "Physical record. The printer in here is standalone, not networked." "Print it," she said. 2 copies. Put one in your personal storage. Keep the other on you." She heard the printer engage in the background, the familiar mechanical sound of a page being produced in a room that was otherwise very quiet. "Ms. Morgan," Reyes said while the printer ran, "there's something else." "Tell me." "Someone else is in the communications monitoring system right now. Not physically, remotely. I can see the access log, a remote login from an external address initiated 4 minutes ago. It's a read-only access, not interfering with anything, just observing. But whoever it is, they're watching the same channel I am." She understood immediately. "That's Foss," she said. "He's watching in real time." "Who?" "It doesn't matter right now. He's not a threat to you. He's watching Whitmore, not you." She thought for a second. Reyes, after you print those logs, I need you to do one more thing. What? I need you to walk those printed copies to Colonel Hartley's office. Personally. Hand them to him directly. Not to his assistant, not to a duty officer. To him. She paused. Can you do that? A silence that lasted long enough to contain a decision. Then yes. Go now, before anyone in Whitmore's chain notices the transmission log is being accessed. Going, he said, and the line went quiet. She stood in the middle of the motel room for a moment, with the phone in her hand and the knowledge that the next hour was going to determine everything. The evidence was moving toward the right people through 3 simultaneous channels. The transmission log through Reyes to Hartley, the digital archive through Diana to the external server, and the physical documentation she had photographed in the records room already verified and time-stamped. 3 channels. Any one of them was enough. All 3 together was something Whitmore could not argue his way out of, regardless of who he called or what suspension orders he manufactured. She thought about what Diana had said, about the question above her clearance level, about the 14 months before the first breach when someone had already been watching, about the $40 million in the human assets whose exposure she was not allowed to ask about directly. She thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who did this work, who walked into places where powerful people had built careful architectures of deception and started pulling threads, who understood that the thread you could see was almost never the only thread, and that the picture you were building was almost never the complete picture until you were standing on the other side of it, looking back. She had been doing this work for 15 years. She had started because she believed in it completely, with the uncomplicated conviction of someone who has not yet seen the underside of the things she's trying to protect. She had continued because, even after she had seen the underside and had lost things she couldn't recover, she still believed that the alternative was worse, that the thing you were protecting, imperfect and complicated, and sometimes deliberately blind to its own failures, was still worth the protection. That was not a comfortable belief. It never had been. But it was the one she had, and it had brought her here to a motel room 3 blocks from a base where a man who had spent 6 years building a network of deception was about to discover that the woman he had called a nobody had already taken everything he had built apart. At 1809, Diana sent her a message that contained 2 sentences. Foss is moving. They have the transmission. She read it twice. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed, which was the first time she had sat down since leaving the sedan, and let herself breathe for a moment that was not controlled or measured or calculated. Just breathe. At 1823, her phone rang, not the encrypted device, her regular phone. The number on the screen was Colonel Hartley's direct line. She answered it. Ms. Morgan, he said. His voice was different from any version of it she had heard over the past 2 weeks. Not the careful, measured tone of their first meeting. Not the apologetic register of his morning text. Something older and more tired and more honest than either of those. Sergeant Reyes just left my office. I know, she said. The transmission log, he said. You knew he was going to do it tonight. I thought he might, she said. He's scared enough and confident enough at the same time. That's a combination that tends to make people move. A pause. The Inspector General's office has been notified. Foss and his team are executing a formal detention order as of approximately 6 minutes ago. He stopped. It's done, Ms. Morgan. She said nothing for a moment. Are you all right? He asked, which was not the question she had expected from him. I'm fine, she said. You should know, he said, that when Foss brings Whitmore in tonight, Whitmore's first statement will almost certainly be that this entire investigation was fabricated, that you manufactured evidence, that the breach record was planted. A pause. He will say that with complete conviction because he is a man who has never in his life seriously considered that he might be wrong. I know, she said. The evidence will hold, Hartley said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. It was the voice of a man confirming something he needed to hear from the person who had built the thing he was confirming. Every piece of it, she said. Collected, transmitted, and verified before the suspension order was processed. Chain of custody is clean. Documentation is clean. There is no argument he can make that touches it. Good, Hartley said quietly. Then after a pause, I owe you an apology. You don't. I put you in a situation without full information, he said. I needed someone to build what I couldn't build. I knew who you were before you arrived. I knew what you were capable of. And I chose not to brief you fully because I was afraid that if Whitmore's surveillance picked up anything in our early communications that suggested a broader coordination, he would shut down before we had enough. Another pause. That was my calculation. I'm not certain it was the right one. She thought about what she had lost in the last 2 weeks in terms of time, strategic positioning, and the dangerous gap she had operated in without knowing its full shape. She thought about the moment in the records room when she had been working with an override code that could have been changed without her knowing. She thought about walking back onto a base under suspension with a badge that might have been flagged and wasn't. It worked, she said finally. The calculation worked. That doesn't make it the right one, but it worked. Yes, he said. Sir, she said, the question about what was exposed during the breaches, whether personnel were compromised, whether people were hurt. A very long silence. That question, he said carefully, is going to be part of the larger investigation that follows from tonight. It is not a question I am in a position to answer right now, but I want you to know that it is a question I have been asking myself for 8 months. His voice was quieter now, and I intend to make sure it gets answered, whatever that answer looks like. It was not the answer she wanted. It was the answer she believed, which was a different thing, but not an entirely unsatisfying one. One more thing, she said. The list of names delivered through Stanton, the person who compiled it. Silence. Was it you, she asked. The silence continued for 3 more seconds. Then no, he said. It wasn't me. Another pause. But I know who it was, and you'll meet them. When this is done and the formal process allows it, you'll meet them. They asked to meet you specifically. She sat with that. They've been inside this for longer than I have, she said, not a question. Much longer, Hartley said. They're the reason there's anything left to build a case on. Without what they preserved, none of this was possible. She thought about that for a long moment. About the unnamed person who had sat inside whatever position they occupied at Fort Liberty and had watched and preserved and waited for an unspecified length of time that was apparently much longer than 8 months for the moment when the thing they were holding could be handed to someone who would know what to do with it. She thought about what that kind of patience cost a person. The weight of carrying something that could change everything while living inside the thing that needed to be changed. She had done it before. Briefly, in a different context, she knew something about that weight. Tell them thank you, she said, from me, before I get to say it myself. I will, Hartley said. They ended the call. At 1847, Diana sent her a photograph. It was a still image captured from a security feed, grainy and slightly overexposed the way security feeds always were, and it showed Major Ryan Whitmore standing in the corridor outside his office on the 2nd floor of Building 7 with Gerald Foss on one side of him and 2 federal agents on the other, and his hands visible and empty and held slightly away from his body in the specific posture of a man who has been instructed not to make any sudden movements. His face in the photograph was turned slightly toward the camera, which meant he was looking down the corridor, which meant he was looking in the direction of the base entrance, which meant he was looking toward the direction of the outside world. The expression on his face was not what she might have expected. Not rage, not the controlled belligerence she had seen in his office, not the cold calculation of their hallway confrontation. It was something simpler than all of those, something younger and rawer, something that looked at this particular moment captured in this particular grainy security, still remarkably like a man seeing clearly for the first time the distance between what he had believed about himself and what he actually was. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she set down her phone and opened her notepad, the same one she had carried since the first day, now dense with 2 weeks of observations and questions and the careful notations of someone who had been building something in the dark and was only now allowed to see what it looked like in the light. She turned to a fresh page. At the top of it, she wrote a single question, not because she needed to write it down to remember it, but because writing things down had always been how she marked the moments that mattered. The question was, who carried this before I arrived? And underneath it, smaller, and for how long? She did not yet have the answer, but she was going to get it. And when she did, she already knew it was going to change the story she thought she was in the middle of into a story that began much earlier and ran much deeper than anything she had yet understood. At 19:03, Raya sent her a text from his personal phone. No encryption, just a regular message from a sergeant who had spent the last 3 hours doing things that could end his career, and had apparently decided on the other side of it that he felt more like himself than he had in months. The message said, "I printed the logs. Hartley has them. I'm going to dinner. Chicken strips tonight, I think." She read it twice, and then she did something she had not done in a very long time. She laughed, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, real, unself-conscious laugh in a quiet motel room, 3 blocks from a base that was at this moment in the middle of the most significant internal reckoning it had experienced in a decade. She typed back, "Good work, Sergeant." She meant it about all of it. The logs, the decision in the hallway, the decision in the records room, the decision to go to the communications station and watch the channels he had told him to watch, and then pick up the phone and call her instead of waiting. All of it. Ceiling for a moment. She thought about the question on her notepad. Who carried this before I arrived? She thought about the fact that somewhere on that base, probably right now in the aftermath of the detention and the formal notifications moving through the chain of command, a person who had been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time was finally putting it down. She thought about what that felt like. The specific feeling of releasing something you have carried through every room and every conversation and every ordinary moment of your life for months or years. The way it didn't feel like relief immediately. The way it felt first like the absence of a weight you had gotten so used to that you had stopped consciously feeling it and had to rediscover what it was like to move without it. She thought about the moment she was going to meet that person, about what they were going to say to each other, and she thought about the fact that this story, the one she had arrived at Fort Liberty 14 days ago, believing she understood, was not the story she had been in at all. It was bigger. It was older. It had more people in it. It ran through channels she had not yet mapped and connected to investigation she had not yet been briefed on, and had a history that predated her involvement by an amount of time she had not yet been told. And somewhere in that larger story, the one she was only beginning to see the edges of was the answer to the question that Diana had told her was above her clearance level. Whether people had been hurt, whether the $40 million in the compromised assets, in the 4 breaches, in the 14 months of watching had cost something beyond money and information. Whether the careful architecture of case building and strategic patience had been worth what it cost on the human level, the level that existed beneath clearances and investigations and formal processes, and the things that got written into official reports. She did not have that answer yet, but she was going to find it. That was not a decision she made in the motel room. It was a recognition of something that had already been decided in her. The way the most fundamental decisions always are at a level below the conscious mind in the part of her that had walked into every difficult situation she had ever faced and walked out the other side still believing the work mattered. She picked up her notepad again, looked at the question she had written, added 3 words underneath the 2 she had already written. The full note now read, "Who carried this before I arrived and for how long I owe them." Then she turned to a new page and started preparing for the conversation that was coming. The one with Gerald Foss, the one where she was going to find out exactly how much bigger this was than Fort Liberty and what it was going to take to finish it. Gerald Foss called her at 2014. Not through Diana, not through an encrypted channel. He called her regular phone, the same number that was listed on her civilian consultant paperwork, which meant he had pulled her file, which meant he had known exactly who she was before he walked into that building with Whitmore that morning, which meant the question he had asked, the quiet "Who is she?" directed at Whitmore's back as she walked away, had not been a question at all. It had been a test. He had been checking whether Whitmore knew what he was dealing with. Whitmore had failed the test completely. She answered on the second ring. "Mr. Foss." A pause on his end, not long, just long enough to register that she had known it was him before he identified himself. "Ms. Morgan," he said. His voice was measured and dry with the particular economy of someone who had spent decades in rooms where every word was being evaluated for what it revealed. "I'd like to meet with you tonight if you're available." "I'm available," she said. "There's a diner on Highway 87 about 4 miles east of the base. Millie's, do you know it?" "I'll find it on 45 minutes, he said and hung up. She was there in 30. She arrived early because she always arrived early, and because arriving early to a meeting with someone she didn't fully understand yet was a basic professional courtesy she extended to herself. She ordered coffee she didn't intend to drink and sat with her back to the wall facing the door and looked at her notepad. The question was still there. Who carried this before I arrived and for how long I owe them? She had added a fourth line in the sedan on the way over. It said, ask Foss about the human cost. Foss walked in at exactly 20:59, 1 minute early, which told her something. He was a man who understood the power of punctuality and used it deliberately. He spotted her immediately, which told her something else. He had either been given a photograph or he had been watching longer than 4 months. He sat down across from her without ordering anything. He folded his hands on the table and looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has been doing a job for a very long time and has reached the stage of it where they no longer need to perform confidence because the real thing has long since replaced the performance. You walked back onto that base this afternoon, he said. Not accusatory, observational. I had unfinished work, she said. Your suspension order was legitimate. My suspension order was obtained by a subject of my investigation, using a contact 2 levels above the base commander, she said. It was procedurally valid and substantively corrupt. I made a judgment call. You made several judgment calls today, he said. All of them were correct. That's not a common occurrence. Is that a compliment? It's an observation, he said. Then after a pause, the transmission log your sergeant preserved tonight combined with the external archive you transmitted through your contact, combined with the physical documentation from the restricted records room, constitutes one of the cleanest evidence packages I have seen come out of an internal corruption case in 22 years of doing this work. She looked at him steadily. You've been doing this for 22 years. In various forms, he said, and Whitmore specifically for how long? He picked up the coffee menu, looked at it without reading it, put it back down. 14 months, he said formally. There was an earlier period of informal attention that I'm not going to put a number on tonight. Before the first breach, she said. He didn't confirm or deny it. He simply held her gaze in a way that was itself a kind of answer. Mr. Foss, she said, I need to ask you something directly, and I need a direct answer. Not a procedural answer, not a clearance level answer. Ask, he said. During the 14 months you were watching Whitmore, during the 4 breaches, were people hurt, not in terms of compromised data or financial cost? People, human beings who were exposed or endangered or lost because of what those breaches revealed to whoever was on the receiving end of Whitmore's transmissions. The diner was not quiet. There were other people, other conversations. The ordinary sounds of a Tuesday evening in a roadside place that had been serving the same menu since 1987. None of it touched the silence that existed specifically between the two of them in the 15 seconds after she asked that question. Yes, Foss said. One word, clean, no qualification, no procedural hedge, no redirection to the appropriate channels, just the word delivered with the weight of someone who had been carrying it and had decided in this specific moment to set it down in front of her. She absorbed it. She had expected it. Expecting something and hearing it confirmed were 2 different experiences, and she let herself feel the difference for a moment before she continued. How many, she asked. That question I can't answer tonight, he said. Not because of clearance. Because the full accounting isn't complete. The investigation into what was passed and to whom, and what happened as a result of what was passed is still active. We are still finding the edges of it. He paused. What I can tell you is that the number is not small. She nodded slowly. She looked at her coffee. She looked at the notepad in front of her. She looked back at him. Then I need to understand something about the timeline, she said. Because if people were being hurt during the 14 months you were building your case, and the case could have been made earlier with a more aggressive approach, that is a cost that needs to be accounted for. Not procedurally, morally. Foss looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted not much, but in the way that things shift in people who have been sitting with a weight for a long time and suddenly find themselves in a conversation that is willing to name the weight accurately. I agree with you, he said quietly. She had not expected that. She had expected defense justification, the language of strategic necessity and greater good and long-term outcomes. She had not expected 2 words delivered in the voice of a man who was genuinely tired. Then why 14 months, she asked. He looked at his hands. Because the first 8 months we didn't have enough to move on. We had behavioral indicators. We had the early stages of a pattern, that looked like something but didn't yet constitute something. Moving too early with insufficient evidence against a decorated officer with Whitmore's record and connections would have ended the investigation, destroyed the case, and left him in place to continue. He paused. That is the strategic reality. I stand behind the strategic reality. But strategic reality and moral reality are not the same thing, and I have not confused them, and I do not intend to. She held his gaze. In the last 6 months after you had enough, a pause that was longer than the others. The last 6 months is a more complicated answer, he said. The last 6 months involves parties and considerations above my operational level. I was not the only decision maker in the room. Who else was in the room? People who will answer for their decisions in a formal review that is going to be very unpleasant for several of them, he said. I will tell you that I advocated for moving faster. I will tell you that my advocacy was not successful until the scope of what Whitmore was connected to became clear enough that the people above me understood we were not dealing with a corrupt officer. We were dealing with a node in a network. She felt the familiar pull of the picture becoming larger than its frame again. A node, she said. Whitmore was passing information, Foss said carefully. He was also facilitating access. The contractor he cleared with the forged signature was not simply a man who walked out of Fort Liberty with sensitive data. He was a courier, a physical carrier of materials that could not be transmitted electronically without triggering automated monitoring systems. He paused. Whitmore knew the monitoring systems well enough to use electronic channels for some communications and physical couriers for others, specifically to avoid the electronic signature that would have been caught earlier. She thought about the contractor, the forged clearance, the 2 weeks between the March breach and the contractor's departure. He gave the contractor time to copy physical materials, she said. Copies of materials that existed only in print, as Foss said. Architectural diagrams, personnel rotation schedules, physical security maps, things that don't live in digital systems precisely because they're too sensitive to store digitally. And those materials went somewhere. They did, Foss said, where he looked at her. That is the active investigation, he said, and it is the reason tonight's detention is not the end of this. It is the reason I'm sitting across from you at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday evening instead of writing my summary report and going home. She understood. You need Whitmore to give you the network, she said. Whitmore giving us the network voluntarily would be ideal, Foss said. His attorney will advise him against it. He will spend the next several weeks believing that the evidence we have, substantial as it is, might not be sufficient for a conviction on the highest charges. He will hold information as a bargaining chip. A pause, which is where you become relevant again. She looked at him. I'm suspended. Your suspension is being rescinded, he said. Hartley filed the formal objection at 1831. The Inspector General's office agreed with the objection at 1947. You received formal notification to your government email at 2402. He looked at her steadily. You may not have checked your government email. I've been in transit, she said. Of course, he said with the first trace of something that was not quite a smile, but was in its general neighborhood. She pulled out her phone, checked the government email. The notification was there. Reinstatement of access, effective immediately, signed by someone at the Inspector General's office, whose name she recognized, and whose signature on that particular document carried a weight that Whitmore's suspension order had never had. She put the phone down. What do you need from me? There is a person, Foss said, who has been inside this investigation longer than anyone. Longer than me. Longer than Hartley. Longer than the 4 months or the 14 months or any official timeline that currently exists in any formal record. He paused. This person is the reason we have the level of documentation we have. The reason the 6-name list exists. The reason the authorization codes were preserved in a form that could be used as evidence rather than simply as internal knowledge that could be denied. The inside witness, she said. Hartley told me I would meet them. Tonight, Foss said. If you're willing, she looked at him. Who is it? He reached into the inside pocket of his unremarkable suit jacket and placed a single photograph on the table between them. It was a military ID photograph, standard format. The kind that appeared in personnel files and base directories, and the kind of place that nobody looked unless they had a reason. She looked at the photograph. She recognized the face immediately. Not from Fort Liberty, not from the past 2 weeks, from earlier. From a period in her own career that predated Fort Liberty by years, from a time and a context that she had not thought about in a long time. And that now, looking at this photograph in a roadside diner at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, came back to her with the particular force of something that has been waiting patiently for you to be ready to see it. The face in the photograph belonged to a woman named Sergeant Major Eleanor Cross. She was 51 years old. She had been stationed at Fort Liberty for 3 years. Her official role was Senior Logistics Coordinator for the base's Operational Support Division, a position that was exactly important enough to give her access to the information she needed and exactly unremarkable enough to give her cover for having it. Claire had known Eleanor Cross in a different context, a long time ago, in a place that neither of them was allowed to name in any conversation that was being recorded. They had worked together for 4 months in circumstances that had required a level of trust that most professional relationships never reach, the kind of trust that is built not through shared experience, but through shared survival. Eleanor Cross had saved her life once, in a way that was not dramatic and was not talked about, and had happened so fast and so quietly that most people in the room hadn't understood what they were seeing until it was already over. Claire had never forgotten it. She had simply filed it in the category of things that had happened that she couldn't repay and could only carry forward. She looked at the photograph for a long time. "She's been here 3 years," she said finally. "She requested the Fort Liberty posting," Foss said. "She identified Whitmore as a risk 8 months before the first breach. She requested the posting specifically to be in a position to document it." Claire looked up from the photograph. She knew what he was doing before it started. She had seen the early indicators in a previous context, Foss said carefully. She recognized a pattern. She couldn't make the case from the outside. She put herself inside. 3 years. Eleanor Cross had put herself inside Fort Liberty for 3 years, carrying the weight of what she knew, living inside the daily reality of a base commanded in practice by a man she knew was compromised, building a record in silence and patience, and at a personal cost that Claire could not fully calculate, but could begin to imagine. "Where is she right now?" Claire asked. "She's outside," Foss said. Claire went very still. "She's here at this diner. She's been in her car in the parking lot since before I arrived," Foss said. "She wanted to make sure you came before she came in." A pause. "She wasn't certain you would remember her." The idea that Eleanor Cross, who had spent 3 years doing what she had done, who had compiled the 6-name list and preserved the authorization codes and handed them to Claire through Stanton, at precisely the right moment could have spent a single moment, uncertain whether Claire remembered her, was something that produced in Claire a feeling she did not have an immediate precise name for. It was somewhere in the territory between grief and gratitude, and a kind of fierce, protective anger on behalf of someone who deserved better than uncertainty. "Go get her," Claire said. Foss stood up. He walked to the door. He opened it and looked into the parking lot and made a small gesture that Claire couldn't see the result of because she was looking at the table, at the photograph, at the face of a woman who had done something extraordinary in the most unextraordinary looking way possible, and had apparently spent some portion of tonight wondering if it had mattered to anyone specific. The door opened again. She heard footsteps. She looked up. Eleanor Cross was 51 years old and looked exactly the way people look when they have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and have just been told they can put it down. There were lines in her face that Claire did not remember from before, which was unsurprising because years did that, especially certain kinds of years. Her posture was the posture of someone whose military bearing was so deeply ingrained that it persisted even through exhaustion, even through the particular weariness of a person who had just watched the thing they spent 3 years building finally produce its result. She stopped at the edge of the table and looked at Claire. Claire stood up. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The diner noise continued around them. Somewhere a child was asking for more ketchup. A country song played on a speaker that was turned slightly too loud. None of it existed in the specific geography between the two of them. "Ellie," Claire said. Eleanor Cross closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. When she opened them, they were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the diner lighting. You remembered, she said. I never forgot, Claire said. Not once. Eleanor sat down. Foss sat down beside her. Claire sat back down across from both of them and looked at Eleanor Cross with the attention of someone who was seeing a complete thing for the first time, even though she had known pieces of it before. 3 years, Claire said. 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days, Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. She had the vocal steadiness of someone who has rehearsed being steady for so long it has become genuine. I requested the posting in August 3 years ago. I was cleared for it 6 weeks later. I arrived here in October. How did you know it was Whitmore? Claire asked. Eleanor folded her hands on the table. It was a gesture that reminded Claire of Foss, the same controlled stillness of someone accustomed to briefing rooms and formal settings, but underneath it was something different, something less bureaucratic and more personal. I worked with him before Fort Liberty, she said. At a previous posting, I saw the way he operated, the way he used relationships, the way he built loyalty in people, and then used that loyalty as a management tool, as a way to control what people said and didn't say, what they saw and didn't see. She paused. When the intelligence community started picking up on a specific type of physical data leak, 18 months before the first breach, and the profile of the leak matched someone with Whitmore's background and access level, I knew. You knew before any official investigation, Claire said. The official investigation didn't exist yet, Eleanor said. I went to 3 people. 2 of them told me I was reading too much into a behavioral profile. One of them told me to be careful. She paused. The one who told me to be careful was Foss. Claire looked at Foss. He nodded once. I believed her assessment, he said. I didn't yet have the standing to act on it officially. I told her to document what she could from whatever position gave her access. I told her I'd build the official case in parallel. And you did, Claire said. 14 months later, Foss said, with the understanding that the documentation she was producing would eventually connect to the official investigation and constitute the foundation of the evidentiary record. Claire looked back at Eleanor. You were never going to be the official face of this, she said. You couldn't be. If Whitmore had known you were building a case, he would have destroyed the documentation and moved the network before we had enough to stop it. I was always meant to be invisible, Eleanor said quietly. I made peace with that a long time ago. A pause. I did not always feel peaceful about it. Something in the simplicity of that sentence opened a space in the conversation that was different from everything before it. The procedural language and the strategic analysis fell away, and what was left was just a woman sitting in a diner telling a small and specific truth about what it had cost her. Tell me, Claire said. Eleanor looked at her for a moment as if she was deciding whether to go all the way into it. Then she looked at her hands and said, there were mornings when I walked onto that base and said good morning to Ryan Whitmore and briefed him on logistics matters and listened to him talk about his soldiers and his unit and his sense of responsibility to this country. And I knew what he was doing, and I could not say it. Not to anyone on that base. Not to anyone who shared that daily reality with me. She paused. There were 4 breaches. I knew about each one before the official notification came down. I knew because I had seen the indicators in the pattern of activity I was monitoring. I knew, and I could not stop them because stopping one breach would have alerted Whitmore that someone was watching and destroyed any possibility of stopping everything. She stopped talking. The diner noise continued around the silence she had created. I'm sorry, Claire said, and she meant it in the complete sense, not as a social formality, but as an acknowledgement of something real. The weight of what Eleanor had carried, the cost of the particular kind of courage that looks like nothing from the outside. The people who were hurt, Eleanor said. I need to know. When the full accounting comes together, I need to know the number. You'll know, Foss said quietly. I promise you that. Eleanor nodded. She looked at Claire. When Foss told me they were bringing in an external consultant to investigate the breaches, I asked to see the file. I read it in 20 minutes. It's a pause. I knew you were the right person. I needed to make sure you stayed long enough to find what was there. The list through Stanton, Claire said, the timing. When the suspension order came through, I understood what Whitmore was doing. He thought he was cutting the investigation off. I needed you to have enough before you left that it didn't matter whether you were officially inside or outside the base. She paused. Stanton is someone I've trusted for 2 years. She didn't know what she was carrying. She just knew it needed to get to you. She made the right call, Claire said. She delivered it without asking questions. That takes a kind of instinct that can't be trained. Eleanor smiled for the first time. It was a small smile, tired and real. She's going to be very good someday, she said, when she understands what she was part of tonight. The three of them sat for a moment with everything that had been said, with the shape of 3 years of work and 14 months of parallel construction and 2 weeks of Claire's investigation. All of it assembled in this particular diner at this particular hour, the full picture visible for the first time from the outside. Then Foss said, "There is still more work." Claire looked at him. "Whitmore is in detention," he said. "The Fort Liberty piece of this is resolved, but the network he was a node in did not stop existing when we detained him tonight. The people on the other end of those transmissions and the physical materials that courier carried out of this base are still out there. The contractor is still out there." He paused. "We have the 6-name list. We have the authorization codes. We have the transmission log. We have the foundation." He looked at Claire directly. "I need someone who can build on the foundation." She understood what he was asking. "You want me to extend the investigation?" "I want you to lead the extension," he said, formally. "Full authorization, full access. Everything that was kept from you in the last 2 weeks reversed completely." Another pause. "This is not a request I am making as a contractor liaison. This is a request being made by the office I work for, which is not the office you may have assumed I work for." She looked at him. "What office do you actually work for?" He reached into his jacket again. This time he placed a credentials card on the table. She read it a second time. She looked up at him. "You've been running this from the beginning," she said. "From before the beginning," he said. "From before Whitmore's name entered the picture officially. This investigation exists in a context that is larger than Fort Liberty, larger than the breaches, larger than a single corrupt officer. What we are dealing with is a systematic effort to compromise specific categories of military intelligence through a method that exploits the trust relationships inside bases exactly like this one." He paused. "Fort Liberty is not unique. It was a proof of concept. And if we don't trace the network back to its source using what we have now, proof of concept becomes operational model." The weight of that settled over the table completely. "How many other bases?" she asked. "3 that we currently have evidence for," he said. "Potentially more." "What's the timeline?" "The network will know Whitmore has been detained within 24 hours, Foss said. "Probably less. When they know, they'll begin deactivating the channels and moving the assets. We have a window. It is not a large one." She thought about 3 other bases, 3 other Whitmores or people like him building networks of deception inside institutions that trusted them. 3 other populations of soldiers who said good morning every day to someone who was quietly selling pieces of their safety. She thought about Eleanor Cross sitting in a parking lot tonight, uncertain whether the person she had saved years ago and had invisibly supported for 2 weeks would remember her. She thought about the question she had written at the top of a fresh page. Who carried this before I arrived, and for how long I owe them? She looked at Eleanor first. "Are you in?" she said. Eleanor didn't hesitate. "I've been in for 3 years," she said. "I'm not stopping now." She looked at Foss. "I need full access, and I mean complete. No suspension orders, no scope limitations, no calls from people. 2 levels above the commander being used to slow the investigation when it gets close to something important. If I find a thread, I follow it. If the thread leads somewhere inconvenient, I follow it there too." "Agreed," Foss said. "And the human cost accounting," she said. "Every person affected by every breach we trace back through this network. I want that on the record. Not as a footnote, as a central part of the final report." Foss looked at her for a moment. "That will make the report very difficult for certain people to read." "Good," she said, another pause. Then he nodded. "Agreed." She looked at both of them, at the credentials card still on the table, at the photograph of Eleanor's face, which was Eleanor's actual face, sitting 3 feet away from her, tired and real, and still in it. "Then we start tonight," he said. "Walk me through everything you have on the other 3 bases, all of it, from the beginning." Foss reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Eleanor reached into the bag she was carrying and placed a second folder next to it. Both folders were thick with the accumulated weight of careful, patient, methodical work done in difficult conditions by people who had kept doing it long after easier options presented themselves. Claire pulled the first folder toward her and opened it. Outside on Highway 87, cars passed in the ordinary rhythm of people going home to ordinary evenings. 4 miles away at Fort Liberty, the base was processing the shock of a detention that had rearranged everything its inhabitants believed they understood about who they were working alongside and who they could trust. In the parking lot of this diner, the gray government sedan sat waiting. And inside in a booth against the wall, three people who understood exactly what they were dealing with began the work of following the network back to wherever it started, however far that was, however inconvenient the destination. The easy part was over. Everything that came next was going to be harder, and Claire Morgan had never once in her life turned away from harder. They worked through the night, not metaphorically, literally. The diner closed at 11, and Millie herself, a woman in her late 60s, with the patient energy of someone who had seen every kind of person come through her door and had stopped being surprised by any of them, brought them a pot of coffee at 10:45 without being asked and told them she'd leave the back lights on as long as they needed. Foss thanked her with the automatic courtesy of someone who understood that kindness offered without expectation deserved acknowledgement without performance. They moved to Foss's vehicle at 11:30, a government SUV with a mobile workstation in the back that told Claire more about who Foss actually worked for than the credentials card had. She set up her laptop alongside his. Eleanor sat between them with her folders and her 3 years of documentation in the particular focused calm of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment for longer than the other two people in the vehicle combined. The three other bases were Fort Caldwell in Georgia Camp, Meridian in Virginia, and a naval installation in South Carolina that the files referred to by a designation number rather than a name, which told Claire that the naval installation's involvement was sensitive enough that even in a secure vehicle with cleared personnel, certain specifics were being managed carefully. "Walk me through Caldwell first," Claire said. "Chronology, from the beginning." Eleanor opened her second folder. Fort Caldwell's indicators started appearing approximately 5 months after the first Fort Liberty breach, she said. Same signature. Physical data extraction combined with electronic communication on inactive channels. The officer profile at Caldwell is different from Whitmore. Younger, less established. But the methodology is identical, which tells us the methodology was taught, not independently developed. Whitmore trained someone, Claire said. Or whoever trained, Whitmore trained both of them, Foss said. The distinction landed in the vehicle and stayed there. Claire wrote it in her notepad. It was the kind of distinction that seemed semantic until you understood its operational implication. If Whitmore was a trainer, the network had one more layer than they thought. If Whitmore and the Caldwell officer shared a common source, the network had an entirely different architecture, one with a center that neither of them was. The contractor who left Fort Liberty, Claire said. The one Whitmore cleared with the forged signature. Has he been located? Not yet, Foss said. He went dark 48 hours after leaving the base. We have his last known location in a city I'm not going to name tonight because we have active surveillance on the location and naming it creates risk. A pause. But the 6-name list your inside source compiled includes his alias. 3 of the 6 names on that list correspond to individuals currently under surveillance in 3 different jurisdictions. Tonight's detention of Whitmore is going to accelerate their awareness that something has changed. We have hours, not days. She understood. The detention had opened the window but had also started the clock. Whoever was at the center of the network, whatever office or handler or controlling intelligence had been running the operation that used Whitmore as a node, they would know by morning that Fort Liberty had gone silent in a particular way, and silence of that kind was its own signal. What do you need from me tonight, specifically? Claire asked. Voss pulled up a digital file on his workstation. The authorization codes from the March 14th log, he said. The 6-character codes. We've matched 4 of them to Fort Liberty's internal system. The other 2 don't match any Fort Liberty code format we have on record. He turned the screen toward her. They don't match Caldwell either, or Camp Meridian. She looked at the codes, at the format, at something in the structure of the last 2 characters of the unmatched codes that tugged at a specific memory she couldn't immediately place. Give me a minute, she said. She looked at them. She had a particular relationship with patterns, had developed it over years of intelligence work, the ability to hold a pattern in her mind and rotate it until it matched something in the catalog of things she had encountered before. It was not a mystical ability. It was trained and practiced and occasionally completely wrong, but it was reliable enough that she trusted it more than she doubted it. The last two characters. The format, a 6-character code with a specific suffix pattern that she had seen in a different context in a different part of the government, in a file she had reviewed during a different assignment 3 years ago that had nothing to do with Fort Liberty or Whitmore or any of the people in this vehicle. She pulled out her personal encrypted device, accessed a file she had not opened in 3 years, read through it with the focused speed of someone who knows what they are looking for even before they find it. She found it in 4 minutes. The suffix format on these two codes, she said, I've seen it before, not in a military context, in a contractor database, a specific contractor database for a company that provides security infrastructure consulting to military installations. She paused. The company was flagged 3 years ago during a different investigation for irregular billing practices. The investigation was closed without action because the billing irregularities couldn't be connected to anything operational. She looked at Foss. I reviewed that file during a separate assignment. I reviewed it and I noted the code format and I filed it, and I did not connect it to anything because at the time there was nothing to connect it to. Foss looked at her with an expression that had shifted from his baseline controlled assessment to something more alert. What's the company? She told him. He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at him. Something passed between them that was faster and more specific than words. What? Claire said. That company, Foss said carefully, holds active contracts at Fort Caldwell, Camp Meridian, in the naval installation. He paused. And at 11 other military facilities across the country. The number 11 sat in the vehicle for a moment with the particular weight of a number that is much larger than the one you were expecting. 11, she said. 11 confirmed, Foss said. The investigation into the 3 bases I told you about tonight was predicated on the assumption that we were dealing with a personnel compromise, an officer or officers who had been turned. The methodology suggested a network, but the network we were modeling was a human network. Officers recruiting other officers. He stopped. What you just told me changes the model completely. Because if the authorization codes connect to this company, Claire said, following the logic at the speed it was moving, then the network isn't built on human recruitment. It's built on infrastructure access. The company installs security systems. They have legitimate access to the code architecture of every facility they contract with. They don't need to recruit officers. They provide the tools that allow a compromised officer to operate without needing technical expertise. They lower the barrier to entry, Eleanor said quietly. It was the first time she had spoken in several minutes, and the precision of the phrase was exact. You don't need to find someone with the technical skill to exploit military security systems if you provide the systems and retain access to the architecture. How long has this company held these contracts? Claire asked. Foss pulled up a database. His fingers moved fast. The oldest contract dates to 6 years ago, he said. 6 years. 1 year before Whitmore arrived at Fort Liberty. Long enough to establish the infrastructure before activating the node. Long enough to make the access look routine and institutional before anyone started using it for something it was not designed for. She thought about what Foss had said earlier, about Whitmore being a proof of concept. She understood now that the proof of concept was not the corruption of an individual officer. The proof of concept was the entire model, an infrastructure company with legitimate government contracts, building a shadow architecture, inside security systems, across a dozen military facilities waiting for the right nodes to activate. This isn't espionage in the traditional sense, she said. This is infrastructure compromise. They built the house and left the back door open before anyone moved in. Yes, Foss said. How long have you known about the company? She asked. A pause, longer than his other pauses. The specific length of a pause that contains something difficult. Elements of what you just described were present in our analysis, he said slowly. But the connection between the code format and the contractor database was not something we had made. Because the contractor database from 3 years ago was in a different investigation file that wasn't cross-referenced with this one, she said. Yes. She looked at him steadily. How many people have reviewed my file in the last 2 weeks? Several, he said, and none of them flagged that I had worked that previous investigation. The flag would have required someone to review both files simultaneously, he said. The investigations were in different departments, different clearance categories. She thought about Hartley's first day, the unfiltered access to documents, the cold coffee, the hour alone in the conference room. She had assumed that disorganization was deliberate management. She understood now that some of it was simply the fractures in an intelligence community that had grown large enough that its left hand and right hand operated in genuine ignorance of each other. The 3-year-old file, she said. Who closed the investigation? Foss looked at the database again. He read the name at the top of the closure report. His expression did something very small and very significant. Tell me, she said. He turned the screen toward her. She read the name. She read it a second time. It was not a name she recognized. But beside the name was a title, and beside the title was an organizational identifier that she recognized immediately, the same organizational identifier that appeared on Foss's credentials card. Someone in your office closed the investigation that would have exposed the contractor 3 years ago, she said. The vehicle was very quiet. Yes, Foss said. His voice had the flatness of a man who has just seen something he did not want to see and is processing it with the discipline of someone who has learned not to react to difficult information before he has fully understood it. Was it deliberate? She asked. I don't know yet, he said. Is the person still in your office? A pause. No, he said. They retired 14 months ago. Another pause. 2 weeks after the first Fort Liberty breach. The timeline aligned with the precision of something that was not coincidence. She let it sit for a moment. The investigation that could have exposed the contractor closed by someone who retired 2 weeks after the first breach that the contractor's infrastructure enabled. 3 years between the closure and the breach. Long enough that the two events would not automatically connect in any standard review process. You need to pull that closure report, she said. Everything in it. Every piece of documentation about why the billing irregularities were deemed non-operational. Because if that decision was made to protect the contractor, then your office has an exposure problem that is separate from the Fort Liberty investigation and potentially more serious. I know, Foss said. And then he said something she had not heard from him before. He said, I'm sorry. She looked at him. You walked into this base 2 weeks ago as a civilian consultant investigating security breaches, he said. What you walked into was the visible surface of something that goes much deeper and that involves institutional failures at levels that had nothing to do with Fort Liberty. You were given partial information. You operated without the full picture, and you still built a case that held. He paused. That is not the way this should have worked, and I am responsible for some of the ways it didn't work correctly. She looked at him for a long moment. Are you telling me this because you genuinely mean it, or because you need me to trust you for what comes next? He met her gaze. Both, he said, genuinely both. It was the most honest thing he had said all night, which she reflected was probably why she believed it. At 1:17 in the morning, her encrypted device lit up with a message from Diana. It said, the contractor has been located. He did not go as dark as they believed. Surveillance team has a position. They're waiting for authorization to move. She showed the message to Foss. He made a call. It lasted 90 seconds. When he ended it, he said, authorization is being processed. It will be ready within the hour. While we wait, Eleanor said, and her voice had changed slightly, carrying something that was not procedural. I need to tell you something, Claire, about why I requested the Fort Liberty posting specifically. Not the strategic reason. The personal one. Claire looked at her. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, arranging something internal that needed to be in the right order before it could be spoken. The operation we worked together, she said, the one we can't name. There was an asset we were running, a person who was providing critical information from inside a hostile organization. You remember. I remember, Claire said quietly. That asset was burned, Eleanor said, 18 months after we concluded our involvement. The information that burned them came from a leak that was traced back to a security failure at a military facility, a facility that was later identified as one of the earliest targets in what we now understand as this network. She paused. The person we were running did not survive being burned. The diner noise was gone now. The highway outside had gone quiet. The only sound was the equipment in the back of Foss's vehicle and the particular silence of two women sitting with the weight of a name that neither of them was going to say out loud. "You've known this whole time," Claire said, "that what happened to them connected back to this." "I suspected it," Eleanor said. "I couldn't prove it. I didn't have the chain of evidence. I had a timeline and a methodology, and the sick certainty of someone who has spent enough time in this work to recognize a pattern even when they can't document it yet." She looked at her hands. "That's why I spent 3 years at Fort Liberty. Not just because I believed Whitmore was compromised, because I believed that if I could build the case on Whitmore, it would eventually lead back far enough to prove what happened to our asset was not random, was not an unavoidable operational risk, was the result of a deliberate infrastructure designed to find and expose exactly the kind of work we were doing." The silence after that was the deepest one of the night. Claire felt something move through her that she didn't try to name or manage or file away for later. She let it move through her completely. The grief of a specific name she would not say in this vehicle or any other vehicle. The anger at 3 years of Eleanor carrying this alone. The fierce clarity that came from understanding exactly why the work they were doing tonight mattered in the most personal possible terms. "We're going to finish it," Claire said. Not loudly, not dramatically, with the simple precision of a statement that was also a commitment. "Yes," Eleanor said, "we are." At 0234, Foss received the authorization. At 0241, he received confirmation that the contractor had been detained by the surveillance team in the city he hadn't named. At 0258, the first preliminary debrief report from the contractor's detention came through on the secure channel. Claire read it. Then she read it again. Then she handed the device to Eleanor and watched Eleanor's face as she read it. "He's talking," Eleanor said. "He started talking before they finished the Miranda advisement," Foss said with the dry precision of someone reporting a fact. "He's been holding this for a long time, and the moment he understood what tonight meant, he decided that the people he was protecting were not worth what protecting them was going to cost him." "What's he giving them?" Claire asked. "Names," Foss said. "Real names, not aliases. The names of the people at the center of the network, who provided the contractor database access, who recruited the officer nodes, who built the infrastructure and maintained it." He paused. "And the name of the person in the office who closed the investigation 3 years ago, and why?" "Why?" she asked. "I was on the payroll," Foss said quietly. "Has been for 4 years. Was recruited 6 months before he closed the file." A pause. "He's not retired. He's in custody in a separate jurisdiction. He was picked up 2 hours ago as part of a parallel operation that I was not fully briefed on until 30 minutes ago." The layers of the operation that had been running around and beneath her own investigation continued to reveal themselves with the particular rhythm of a story that had more architecture than any single person inside it could see from their own position. She had built her piece. Eleanor had built her piece. Foss had built his. Diana had built hers. Reyes and Webb and Hartley and Stanton had each contributed their piece. And somewhere above and around all of them, a structure had been assembling that none of them had seen in its entirety until this moment. She thought about the mentor who had told her that the work was real, even when the context was not what you were told. She thought about it with new layers of understanding. "How many people total?" she asked. "In the network, based on what the contractor is giving them." Vosa looked at the screen. "Preliminary count is 19, he said, across multiple facilities and multiple contractor organizations. The company that holds the security contracts is one piece. There are 2 others operating in a similar model." He paused. "Claire, the scale of this is larger than anything I briefed you on tonight. Larger than anything I fully understood until 30 minutes ago." She looked at him. "Are we stopping them tonight?" "Significant portions of the network are being rolled up as we speak," he said. "The full operation will take days, possibly weeks. Some elements are in jurisdictions that require additional process." He paused. "But the architecture is compromised. The back door has been found. Every facility that contracted with these companies is being notified through emergency secure channels tonight. The infrastructure they built is being shut down element by element." She thought about the 11 facilities, about the soldiers at each of them who had been going about their work inside buildings whose security systems had a door they didn't know about, About the officers like Whitmore who had used that door, and the other officers, the ones like Webb and Reyes and Eleanor, who had done their jobs with integrity inside a compromised environment and had not known the full shape of what surrounded them. At 04:16 in the morning, Foss took a call that lasted 12 minutes. When he ended it, he looked at both women with an expression that had completed its transformation from the controlled professional baseline she had first seen in the diner into something more human and more tired and more genuine than any version of it she had encountered over the previous hours. The contractor's debrief has produced a name, he said. One name, the person who originally conceived and implemented the infrastructure compromise model. The person who identified the contractor entry point and built the methodology that Whitmore and the others were trained to use. He paused. This person is not a military officer, not a contractor, not anyone whose name appears in any of the files we have been working with tonight. Who is it? Eleanor asked. Foss said the name. Claire did not recognize it. She looked at Eleanor. Eleanor's face had gone through something rapid and complex that resolved into an expression that was not shock, but was in the same territory as shock, expression of someone who has suspected a thing for a long time and is now being told they were right, and finding that being right is not the relief they expected it to be. You know the name, Claire said to Eleanor. I know the organization, Eleanor said carefully. The name is new, but the organization. She stopped, looked at Foss. We've been trying to trace this organization for 7 years. It doesn't have a clean identifier. It operates through intermediaries, through companies like the contractor database company, through individuals who appear unconnected. 7 years and we've never had a name. We have one now, Foss said. The weight of 7 years against one name arrived at in the back of a government SUV at 4 in the morning. Through the accumulated work of a network of people each carrying their own piece, was something Claire let herself feel completely for one long moment. Then she said, what do we do with it? We build the case, Foss said, the same way you built the case on Whitmore, methodically, completely, with a chain of evidence that cannot be argued away, regardless of how many suspension orders anyone tries to manufacture. He looked at her. It's going to take time. How much time? She asked. I don't know, he said honestly. More than 2 weeks. She almost smiled. I've been known to take longer than 2 weeks on a case. At 06:30, as the first pale suggestion of morning began to assert itself against the darkness outside, Claire stepped out of the vehicle for the first time in hours. She stood in the empty parking lot of a closed diner on Highway 87 and breathed the cool morning air and looked at the sky and let the full weight of the night settle into its proper place. Eleanor came and stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that exists between people who have been through enough together that words are optional. The asset, Claire said, finally quietly into the morning air. Yes, Eleanor said. We're going to be able to prove it, Claire said. When the case is complete, we're going to have the chain of evidence that shows what happened and why and who made it happen. I know, Eleanor said. Is that enough? Claire asked. It was the most honest question she had asked all night, because she genuinely did not know the answer, and she wanted Eleanor's answer specifically because Eleanor had been carrying this longer and deserved to define what enough looked like. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. No, she said finally, it's not enough. It will never be completely enough. But it's what we can do, and doing what we can do is different from doing nothing. It's always been different from doing nothing, even when the difference is hard to see from where you're standing. She paused. That's why we do it. Claire nodded slowly. That was the truest thing anyone had said in a very long time. At 0800, she walked back onto Fort Liberty for the third time in 3 days. This time she walked through the main gate with full reinstated credentials, and Foss beside her, and Eleanor one step behind, and the complete evidentiary record of everything that had happened at this base and beyond, it moving through official channels with the unstoppable momentum of something that has been properly documented by people who knew what they were doing. The first person she saw inside the gate was Corporal Stanton, who was beginning her morning shift and who looked up when she saw Claire and went through a rapid, visible sequence of emotions before settling on something that was simply relief. Ms. Morgan, Stanton said. Corporal Dunn, Claire said. You did the right thing yesterday. Stanton looked at the folder in Claire's hands, at Foss's credentials visible on his jacket, at Eleanor Cross walking beside them, with the bearing of someone who was done being invisible. She put the pieces together with the instinct that Claire had already identified in her. Is it over? Stanton asked. This part, Claire said. The next part is just starting. Stanton nodded. Something settled in her face. The kind of settling that happens in a person when they understand that the ground they are standing on is real and will hold. The formal proceedings that followed occupied the rest of that day and the days after it. Whitmore's formal charges were filed. The contractor's debrief was incorporated into the evidentiary record. The three other bases were notified and their own internal reviews initiated. The company whose contracts had served as infrastructure for the network had those contracts suspended pending investigation by agencies with jurisdictions that Claire was only partially briefed on. Webb gave a third statement, this one on record with the Inspector General's office, that incorporated every detail he had previously withheld and produced a document that Foss told her privately was the clearest single witness account of an internal corruption operation he had read in his career. Reyes was formally commended. He received the commendation with the specific embarrassment of someone who did not believe they had done anything worth commending and required two separate people to explain to them in detail why they were wrong. The second person to explain it was Claire in a 10-minute conversation in a hallway, and when it was over, Reyes looked at his shoes for a moment and then looked at her and said, I just preserved some logs. And she said, you preserved everything. And he nodded once and went back to work, which was exactly the right response. On the fourth day after Whitmore's detention, Major Ryan Whitmore requested a meeting with Claire Morgan, not through his attorney, not through official channels, through a handwritten note delivered by the detention facility's administrative staff that said simply, I need to talk to the consultant, please. She could have declined. She had no procedural obligation to meet with him. The case against him did not require her participation in any interview process. She could have filed the note and moved on. She went. I was sitting at a table in a small meeting room when she entered. He looked like the same man and also like a completely different man, which was the specific appearance of someone whose self-concept has undergone a structural revision. The physical fact of him was unchanged. The authority he had carried in every room she had seen him in was not present. It was not simply that he had lost his rank or his freedom of movement. It was that the thing underneath those external markers, the bedrock certainty that he was right and competent and justified, had shifted. She could see the shift in the way he held his shoulders and the way he looked at her when she sat down, without the evaluative dismissal she had seen in their first meeting, without the cold hostility of their confrontation. He looked at her the way people look at someone they are seeing for the first time, even though they have met before. Thank you for coming, he said. You asked, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I wanted to ask you something, he said, and I understand if you don't answer, but I need to ask it. Ask, she said. How long did you know, he said. From the beginning, when you walked in on that first day. How much did you actually know? She considered the question honestly. On the first day, I knew something was wrong with the March report, and I knew it had a human cause rather than a technical one, she said. I didn't know it was you specifically until the third day. By the fifth day, I had a pattern that pointed clearly in your direction. By the end of the second week, I had the documentation to support what the pattern showed. He absorbed this. You never showed it, he said. You never gave anything away. No, she agreed. I thought you were. He stopped. You thought I was nobody, she said. Not unkindly, precisely. Yes, he said. The word cost him something visible. That's why it worked, she said. Not because I tricked you, because you decided what I was before you had any evidence for your decision. And then you operated entirely on the basis of that decision, regardless of what I actually did in front of you. I was quiet for a long time. I've been thinking about that, he said finally, about how certain I was, about how much of what I did was based on that certainty. He looked at his hands. I made decisions that hurt people, based on that certainty, that I was right, that I knew what I was looking at, that people who challenged my assessment were wrong by definition. He paused. I'm not saying that to ask for anything. I just need to say it out loud to someone who was in the room. She looked at him, at the man who had grabbed her arm and thrown her file across the room and told her she was nobody, at the man who had pressed his hand on her shoulder and told her to get on her knees, at the man whose certainty had enabled a network of damage that was still being fully mapped and whose human cost was still being counted. She did not forgive him in that room. She was not there to forgive him. Forgiveness was not the transaction he was asking for, and not the one she was prepared to offer. What she could offer was the thing she had always offered in the work she did: honest witness. The acknowledgement that something real had happened and that she had seen it. "I heard you," she said. "What you just said, I heard it." He nodded. It was enough. It was what he had come for. She left the meeting room and walked back through the corridor and out into the morning. Foss was waiting by the vehicle. Eleanor was on the phone, her voice low and focused, already working the next thread of the case that would take them from Fort Liberty to wherever the name at the center of this network eventually led. The sun was fully up now. The base moved around them in its morning rhythm, soldiers going about the work of a day that looked almost ordinary from the outside and was not ordinary at all underneath, because the ground had shifted beneath it, and what it was built on was being understood more completely than it ever had been before. Foss looked at her as she reached him. "How was it?" he asked. "Necessary," she said. He nodded. He understood that word completely. She looked at Eleanor, who was finishing her call, who had spent 3 years of her life doing something invisible and essential, and had done it without asking whether it would be acknowledged or remembered or understood by anyone except herself. She looked at her and thought about the asset they had both known and the work that would eventually produce the proof that what happened to them was not random. She thought about Reyes eating his chicken strips. She thought about Stanton handing over a piece of paper without asking questions. She thought about Webb walking into her office and placing his hands flat on the table and saying the thing he had been afraid to say for 7 months. She thought about Hartley leaving the files unfiltered on the first day and hoping she would find what he couldn't point her toward directly. She thought about all the people who do the work that is never announced, who carry the things that are too heavy to carry, loudly, who protect the ground that everyone else stands on without knowing it is being protected. She thought about what it meant to be one of those people, what it had always meant, what it would continue to mean in the days and weeks of work ahead, the next part that was just beginning. She picked up her briefcase. She looked at the base around her, this place she had arrived at 20 days ago as a woman. Nobody took seriously, and she felt something that was not pride exactly and not satisfaction exactly, but was in the same territory as both and was truer than either. She was ready. The real work of a warrior had never been about the moment the room went silent and the people who had dismissed her finally understood what they were looking at. It had never been about the confrontation or the revelation or the dramatic turning point when the truth could no longer be denied. Those moments mattered, but they were not the work. The work was everything before them. The early mornings and the late nights and the cold coffee and the careful documentation and the decision to walk back through a gate when every procedural rule said she shouldn't. The work was Reyes standing by a cabinet with steady hands. The work was Eleanor in a parking lot outside a diner wondering if she would be remembered. The work was Webb putting his hands flat on a table and choosing to stop dropping it. The work was doing the right thing in the right way for the right reasons, precisely when nobody was watching and nothing was guaranteed, and doing it so thoroughly and so honestly that when the moment finally came when everyone was watching, truth was already so solidly built that it could not be argued away by anyone. That was what Claire Morgan had always known. That was what she had carried from the first day she walked into this field and every day since. That was the thing she had never needed to announce because the work itself announced it. She was not the woman nobody took seriously anymore. She was exactly who she had always been, and this time finally everyone who needed to know it knew.